Um, Evening, everybody. We're stepping back a little bit in that Bridget got elevated to a week earlier or 2 weeks earlier. So now we pick up what we ought to have been looking at 2 weeks ago. Will the real Patrick please stand up? The authentic voice of a patron saint. Let me begin by referring to an early Irish saga, The Wooing of Etienne, in which a poet expresses an idyllic world. There's a fair lady with beautiful hair, healthy body, fruitful and picturesque land, choice mead and wine, meat and milk, no sin or waywardness, and ultimately no death. It is a vision of another world, an idealized world. And behind it is the harsh reality of life, which the readers and hearers of the poem knew. The early Irish lived on a fairly temperate island on the edge of the western seaboard, but the island was at times hit by powerful and destructive storms, and there were harsh and cold winters and sometimes summer droughts. These people, though, were not isolated. Not only were the rivers the M1 and M7 of ancient Ireland, but the sea was a superhighway, making journeys possible, enhancing trade, not only with the neighbouring island, but also with mainland Europe and North Africa. Foreign traders came here, some staying, and Irish traders brought foreign women back to Ireland who were assimilated into Irish society. Central to trade and the economics of the time was slavery, with raiding parties going in both directions between these islands and taking people into slavery and captivity. And this was big business, and it was lucrative. It was not just trade, it's never just trade, but it was also the exchange and the interaction of ideas leading to cultural diversity. No society is ever homogeneous, and Ireland was no different. Yet life was harsh, and the wooing of Etienne dreams of another world as well as another world. In the midst of reality, especially harsh reality, people will dream of something better. There will always be the wooing of Etienne. So let's look at Patrick's world. It was into this kind of Ireland that Patrick came as a 16-year-old slave, captured and taken from his family estate in the northwest, probably of Roman Britain. The trauma experienced by a teenager, snatched out of his world, family and culture, as experienced by every slave, is unimaginable. He made his escape later from Ireland and travelled back home. Some years pass when Patrick, in France or Britain, undertakes theological and religious formation for a life in the church. It is remarkable when he has some sense of calling to return to the island of his enslavement. And he voluntarily travels to Ireland as a person on a mission to the Irish. At the hands of the Irish, he suffered the violence of slavery, and yet he returns to do nothing but good with them and for them. Now, some will see an act of forgiveness here, which not everyone would find possible or easy. The traditional date for his return to Ireland is 432 CE, which has no historical basis. It's a made-up date, as probably is 450 CE, another date given for Patrick's arrival in Ireland, which may, though, be more likely. Well, we don't know. In one sense, we know very little about Patrick, which is probably why he's been reinvented hundreds of times in Ireland and wherever the Irish diaspora are found. Looking for the historical Patrick is difficult, maybe impossible, but we do have two historical documents that are not biographical, but they do provide us with insights into some aspects of his character. In terms of history, we have one piece of historical information, all the more precious because it is only one reliable, authentic line. Prosper of Aquitaine, in his chronicles, has a line with reference to 431 CE. And he writes, "To the Irish believing in Christ, ordained by Pope Celestine, Palladius is sent as their first bishop." It's a very significant sentence. "To the Irish believing in Christ, ordained by Pope Celestine, Palladius is sent as their first bishop." Now, Prosper was not only a contemporary, but he was involved in this piece of activity that brought a Bishop Palladius to the Irish who believe. And this is before Patrick ever arrives in Ireland. And it deconstructs one of our big pieces of fiction, perhaps, that Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland. In one sense, he did. But what Prosper is saying and implying is that in 431, there already were enough Irish Christians to require a bishop, and that there was also a community sufficiently organized to request a bishop and to communicate their request to Rome. Furthermore, these Irish were already, if you like, indigenous and native peoples on this island. Now, we can't go much further than that without creating more fiction from Prosper's words. But that entry in his chronicles is a piece of precious history. Christianity was in Ireland before Patrick. Now, Patrick was not Irish, but Romano-British. He was born into Roman Britain, and the British bit does not mean British as it means today, if we do know what British means today. At the Union of the Crowns in 1603, King James VI of Scotland became James I of England, and he invented the word British to describe the people of his new expanded kingdom. He also invented the divine right of kings, which conveniently put him above question and demanding obedience as of God. That's power. Patrick belongs to a more ancient world dominated by Roman imperialism, the mighty Roman Empire which invaded Britain in 55 BCE and was still there over 500 years later when Patrick came to Ireland. It wasn't going to be there for much longer because the empire was about to go the way of every empire in history. Rome was about to crash out of history and become historical wreckage with all the post-imperial destruction and legacy the fall of an empire brings. The Romans never got to Ireland. It was close, as they did have a small army ready to cross from somewhere near Cairnryan, when there was a nasty Scots revolt, Scots maybe looking even then for their independence, diverted the Roman forces. It spared Ireland the Roman presence and Roman dominance. Now, the Romans centralized everything, creating administrative structures highly organized and so effective that the church in Britain, as elsewhere, shaped its dioceses around the administrative boundaries, and ecclesial governance imitated political governance. Ireland without the Romans remained decentralized, with up to 150 sub-kingdoms, or tuata, and the church structure was monastic, with the abbots and the abbesses holding the power and not bishops. Ireland was decentralized in every way, and it was into this Ireland that Christianity took root, and Patrick eventually came, perhaps in 450 CE. However effective he was as a person on a mission, he never succeeded in imposing a diocesan structure on the early Irish church. And that never happened until 1101 CE. The Irish church would be a community monastic-based church for some 700 years. Let's look at Patrick's letters. There are, of course, lives of Patrick written in Armagh at different times, and some 2 or 3 centuries after Patrick had returned to Ireland. And it's impossible to tell legend from fact in these lives. They're certainly not biography, but are lives written for political purposes. Because in the 7th or 8th centuries, there was a battle going on in the Irish Church for primacy. Where would the ecclesial centre of power be? And the contest for primacy was between Armagh and Kildare. And Lives of Patrick were written in Armagh, associating the saint with Armagh and putting forward the case for Armagh to hold the primacy of the Irish Church. I suppose 2 things worth noting here. Spirituality and religion are not averse to playing politics and power games. There are ecclesial leaders who rather enjoy it. This was the era of Christendom. And for the last almost 4 centuries, the church in Europe was already in bed with the empire and inseparable from political power. The other thing is that the lives of Patrick from Armagh are invented fiction and fake news, which predates Trumpism by centuries. Telling big lies about Brexit was also nothing new. And they were pretty good at spin in Armagh 1400 years ago. And Armagh still holds the primacy for Irish Catholics and the Church of Ireland. But we do have 2 authentic documents believed to be from Patrick. There is historical consensus on this. And the 2 authentic documents are Patrick's confession and the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. They are 2 of the most remarkable documents surviving from ancient times. It's not really possible to date them, except to say that they belong to the latter years of Patrick's life. He has been in Ireland for some time when he was forced to write these 2 documents. Now, he didn't drive snakes out of Ireland, but he did battle over a lifetime with forces, negative forces, even forces of evil, which I suppose is what the snake smith is trying to highlight. The world then had a greater appreciation of the power of myth and mythology than we sophisticated scientific people have. Though beyond scientism now, we are recovering the power of myth to express profound truth in story form. So 2 short documents from Patrick open up windows on the world of then and into what really mattered for a remarkable person struggling with social injustices and ambiguities within his own character and personality. He emphasizes in his confession his weakness and sinfulness so much that there are sometimes you want to stop him beating himself up and get over his inferiority complex. But in the confession, his life and work are under serious attack, with critics who do not think that he's up for the job, he's not fit for purpose. Others think he's not sufficiently well educated, he's having to pay protection money to do his work, and others accuse him of misappropriating money or not disclosing the sources of his income. His orthodoxy is called into question. Is he truly Christian at all? There are threats of kidnapping and violence against him. And then somebody, we learn, a close childhood friend, for whatever reason, makes public some dark secret from years past, something Patrick did, which he thought was long past. But now it's gone viral. In the world of then, it was probably one of 3 terrible sins. Sexual immorality, and we've all just thought that, idolatry, and murder. A real possibility is that in his youth, Patrick, in some moment of anger, did take another's life. Whatever. Now, 5th century Facebook has dragged it up again. And the social media of the day has put him in the dock once more. An attempt to discredit and assassinate his character. Well, all of this forces Patrick to write the confession and defend himself and his character and his life's work. The second document is from a very angry Patrick to the soldiers of Coroticus, a Pictish chieftain who has raided Ireland and taken possibly hundreds of people into slavery, killing many in the raiding process and abusing in violent ways the rights and the lives of human beings. We'll come back to this letter in the second half. But neither of these documents is history or biography as we know them. But there are fascinating insights into Patrick's life struggles and Ireland during a very turbulent time. Someone has put it this way. The two letters are in fact the earliest surviving documents written in Ireland and provide us with glimpses of a world full of petty kings, pagan gods, quarrelling bishops, brutal slavery, beautiful virgins, and ever-threatening violence. But more than anything else, they allow us to look inside the mind and the soul of a remarkable man living in a world that was falling apart and at the dawn of a new age. I suppose it is a world falling apart and the dawn of a new age that might have resonance for us in an Ireland and a world that may be undergoing profound change and still more change in the next decade or two. In Patrick's letters, we may be reading letters of hope in a trying and uncertain time. Well, let's take a little time in groups or rooms which Loretto will allocate. There are a couple of possible questions to discuss if you want. In Armagh, in the 7th and 8th centuries, religion played power politics with Patrick's life. So what does power, and especially political power, do to religion? Can religion avoid the seduction of power? And the other question is, why do you think Patrick had to write a confession to defend his character and life's work? And how do you think he felt when 5th century social media dragged up some dark blot from his past life? Well, spend a bit of time on those. We can take a good 20 minutes maybe, and or there may be other questions that you feel are more important for you. But enjoy. Let's go. Sorry, folks, I don't know what's happening, but if you believe in the resurrection, then maybe this is it. Something's come back to life. But here we go to look at the second half and a heading, A Cry for Justice. And this takes us, I think, to the heart of that very angry letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. And Patrick doesn't mince his words in the letter, which is not a private letter, but it is to be read, and is to be read in public. This letter, protesting evil, calls Coroticus and his soldiers father killer and brother killer and raging wolves. And in what I suppose is now offensive language in itself, Patrick uses the image of a prostitute as a she-wolf devouring parts of Christ's body or handing over members of Christ to a whorehouse, he says. And then Patrick identifies greed as the root cause of evil. Greed drove the slave trade of Coroticus, as it drove the European Christian slave trade of our modern era, and built the cities of Bristol and London and Liverpool and Manchester and Glasgow. It was greed that drove the slave trade, that produced the Industrial Revolution, that built the empires with their economies of extraction, that constructed a racist world of white supremacy and leaves us today complicit in our racially constructed world and struggling with the terrible legacies of colonialism and a world of inequalities. Patrick wrote in the letter, "They live by plunder." That was Coroticus, and I suppose every European empire, and America and China. And the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus is a speaking of truth to power. It's a protest against socio-economic evil and a cry for justice and liberation. Now, the letter ends with a clarion cry for the liberation of all the enslaved. And what may surprise us in reading the end of the letter, it's a cry for the liberation of women. Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland, a person for all seasons, it has been said, is the first person to call for the abolition of slavery and for the liberation of women. And said the author, that call will not be made again until the 17th century. In a world of racial and gender inequality, it is still a call that needs to be heard and in many ways is being heard in our world again. But let's look at Patrick as a secular saint for all. There are very few saints, I suppose, with the universal appeal of St. Patrick. On the 17th of March, St. Patrick will be celebrated around the world and in some surprising places. In Chicago, the river turns green. Buildings in the Far East are lit up in green. My daughter lived for 10 years in Auckland, New Zealand, and on the 17th of March each year, an entire street in the centre of Auckland was and still is closed off for a day of celebration. For each of the 10 years she was there, she took the day off work to join it and enjoyed a big street party, and for all of the decade that she lived there. Now, that did not happen on St. George's Day, St. Andrew's Day, or St. David's Day, even though there are a lot of English, Scots, and Welsh in New Zealand. I think I'm correct in saying that Beijing goes green on St. Patrick's Day. Some years ago, I was in Chicago just before St. Patrick's Day, leaving to come back home on the 15th of March. And near the university where I was, there was a bakery. It had its windows decorated with shamrocks and a large notice that they sold Irish soda bread. Well, I couldn't resist going in to buy an Irish soda. Now, you may know that in Northern Ireland we have soda farls, and in West Cork, where I lived for a while, they have soda bannocks. And what I bought as Irish soda bread in Chicago looked like neither. I don't know what it was, but having bought it, I ate it. Patrick, I suppose, has universal appeal. On St. Patrick's Day, all our political leaders think it's important to be in Washington, and a shadow government, only about 2 ministers stay put in Dublin as the key cabinet ministers travel to different parts of the world around St. Patrick's Day on trade missions. And many of the northern politicians also head now for Washington on St. Patrick's Day. Patrick is a secular saint for all. So, called St. Patrick, you don't have to be Christian or even religious, it seems, to celebrate him. Now, there will be towns and the communities across Ireland in a couple of months' time or a month's time where parades and dressing up and lorries and trailers will be decorated and prizes are made for the best on parade. But who is the Patrick being celebrated. Now, he's been reinvented many times during the centuries since he returned to Ireland. There will be religious services, street parties, parades, and he's good for trade and business. Is he a religious saint, a cultural icon, even a nationalist icon? He has been described as a person for all seasons. I suppose I'm describing him as a secular saint for all, because I think in some ways this is a great paradox about Patrick. He holds together the sacred and the secular. He's very much alive in our secular world. And he's also there for many as a person of faith and deep faith values. Now, secular means the separation of church and state, religion and politics. That, of course, was not the case when Patrick lived and walked these parts. It is now in our Western world, Europe, the UK, and Ireland of the 21st century. In that sense, our world and St. Patrick's world are completely different. But in our democratic, pluralist, and secular world, it seems that the icon still lives. The saint is still the saint in the secular. I want to try and highlight 3 living issues from this secular saint's life. No future without forgiveness. Now, these are not Patrick's words, but the title of a book written by the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, another remarkable secular saint. Patrick could quite easily have used these words. The trauma experienced by a 16-year-old boy captured and carried off into the life of a slave in a land other than anything he had known, the trauma of that is beyond our comprehension. That was the teenage Patrick's experience. And somewhere in Ireland, he spent his teenage years looking after pigs on a cold and wet hillside. He escaped, he made his way home. Then years later, he voluntarily returned to Ireland to do all the good for the Irish that he could. Why return to a people who had traumatized you and treated you so badly? Why would he want to return to a people and a place which had robbed him of his crucial teenage years and come back with good news and love and respect and work for their good and well-being? Somehow, I suspect Patrick worked through his past, come to terms with it, and perhaps reached a point where he made a moral decision that the past would not dominate his life and control him. And he would walk among these people and do all the good he could. He made a new future for himself. He offered a new future, a different future for those who had almost destroyed his life. And that, I suppose, is what the very difficult and frequently misunderstood word forgiveness means. Tutu realized this in South Africa as it struggled to emerge from the evil system of apartheid and all the suffering that apartheid had caused over decades in South Africa. No future without forgiveness, and the F word really means release from the past, liberation from the past, not allowing it to dominate and control life and repress and prevent the future. Florence, not her real name, got caught up in gunfire years ago. Shots fired at security forces hit her, and a bullet lodged very close to her heart. She pulled through, but surgeons could not remove the bullet, so close to her heart that she would not have survived the surgery. She knew there would be serious difficulties, and in the last years of her life, the lead from that bullet was weeping and seeping into her body and her bloodstream. She died about 2 years ago. But she had long decided that those who had almost taken her life and destroyed so much of her quality of life would not dominate or control her life, The past would not get being. Anger, bitterness, vengeance would not be the controlling factors. And for the rest of her life, she worked tirelessly for improved community relations, peace, and reconciliation. And that good she chose to do was in her local community. She carved out her liberated future, and she helped others to a different and a better future. And as with Patrick and Desmond Tutu in South Africa, that is forgiveness, and there is no future without it. Welcoming the stranger. Ireland's patron saint was not Irish. The most famous Irish person in the world was not one of us. But what does one of us mean? Patrick came from elsewhere. He was Romano-British. And as we already noted, British doesn't mean what we think it means now. His father and grandfather's names in the Patrick's Confession are in Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. The empire never reached Ireland. Coins, artifacts, and trading goods have been unearthed in Ireland, but the Roman Empire never colonized Ireland. Patrick came from that Roman world, by violent force removed from it and enslaved in Ireland. And so a foreigner has now become more Irish than the Irish, or the Northern Irish. We have welcomed the stranger. But we need to be careful perhaps about our language. We're using the language of modern and conflicted identity politics to make Patrick into one of us. At the same time, he didn't choose to be here. He did return voluntarily, but he was still a stranger in a strange land. And thousands of people have ended up on this island like Patrick. We describe them as migrants or refugees. Sometimes they're welcomed, sometimes they're not. But like Patrick, they too did not choose to be here. They have been forced here by war, violence, economic necessity, and now and into the future, fleeing the worst effects of climate change. Meanwhile, in our society, race, hate crimes are overtaking sectarian hate crimes. Patrick came here from somewhere else, and so did most of us. We've either forgotten or we've never known our story. My ancestry is a mix of Scottish, Cornish, and Italian, and that is as far as I know. Like those very old skulls dug up on Rathlin Island, there is a line there going back to Kiev in modern Ukraine. And so my people were on the move, part of human migration. And at some point, your people were too. We are Homo sapiens, going back 200,000 years. And beyond that, we came out of Africa. And we are really Homo migratio. Humans have always been moving for all sorts of reasons, and so too have non-human creatures. Migration is a constant of life and is even essential and indispensable for sustained communal well-being. We all move from somewhere to here, and who of us in our family histories do not have those who left here for different reasons and made a life for themselves elsewhere? We gloss their movement by calling them expats, but they are migrants. Homo migratio, and so it will go on and continue. In 1878, a young man left a small town in Polish Russia, and he ended up, you might say of all places, he ended up in Hartlepool. And he wandered around Yorkshire as a peddler. He came to Leeds, and he got a job with a group who employed refugees. Twice a week, he set out his little trestle table. And then he got a stall in the covered Leeds market selling nails, screws, pins, and needles. And with the cashier of the group employing him, he set up with Thomas Spencer a little business. And in 1894, Marks and Spencer was born. And by 1903, there were 40 shops. And when Michael Marks died from exhausting work in 1907, there were 60 shops. Where would we be without Marks and Spencer? And what has been the contribution of Marks and Spencer to the Irish and the UK economies? Without the initiative of a Jewish migrant, Michael Marks. And you may well have clothing on you with the brand name St. Michael on the label. Homo migratio, that's all of us. Patrick was one of us after all. And through him we are challenged to welcome the stranger and resist that insidious human construct of racism and ethno-nationalism that are so hate-centered and destructive. The last theme is the cry for justice again. I think we've made more of Patrick's confession, generally. It is one of the most remarkable documents of early European Christianity. It's a classic, it's a treasure, which belongs to all of us in Ireland. We may not be that familiar with it, which is a pity, but classic and treasure that the confession is, I suspect we know even less of Patrick's letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. It is again a very angry letter written to a powerful chieftain who is making his wealth and building his power on trafficking slaves. Coroticus has killed and enslaved many who've had their lives destroyed and shortened by slavery. Their rights to life, security, existence have been denied, and Patrick will not remain silent in the face of greed and corruption and violence against human life. The angry letter written to be read in public is a deep, painful cry for justice. Patrick demands justice, that human life be respected and human dignity have the freedom and the space to flourish. That there is equality of dignity and rights, and all are treated with the dignity and worth that they have as beings made in the image of the God of life. That all human life is sacred, all life is sacred. And when a Coroticus or anyone else, or any political or economic system forgets that and diminishes that sacredness, there is slavery, there is violence, war, oppression, dehumanization, and life becomes cheap and brutish and ultimately evil. Patrick's cry for justice still needs to be heard. Here in Northern Ireland, 250,000 people live in absolute poverty. 17% of them are children. Nearly 1 in 4 people live in absolute poverty. In the Republic of Ireland, 630,000, 1 in 8 people live below the poverty line, 26% children. These are justice issues. And the angry cry for justice from Patrick needs to be heard. 8 years ago, a court found that the Northern Ireland Executive not having an anti-poverty strategy was unlawful. Well, 8 years later, we still don't have an anti-poverty strategy. The cry for justice. Patrick called for an end to slavery. Perhaps he was the first voice in Ireland to do so. Slavery became a European profitable trade as 500 years of European imperial power dominated the planet and Africa in particular. It was also known as European Christian slave trade because the church was bound up with it. After Patrick, I suppose the next voice from this island to oppose and call for an end to slavery was Daniel O'Connell, better known for bringing through the House of Commons Catholic emancipation in Ireland and in Britain, and the emancipation also for Jews. But O'Connell also opposed slavery in the House of Commons. And he was the key speaker at the launch of a big drive at a rally in London to abolish slavery. We're still dealing with the fallout of slavery and struggling with the institutionalized racism that is part of it. And Patrick's cry for justice still needs to be heard. At the end of his confession, Patrick was advocating for a fairer and more equal treatment of women. In modern terms, he was opposed to misogyny, the hatred of women, sexism, or the domination of women, and he was opposed to violence against women. And in the confession, Patrick was well ahead of his time. The levels of violence against women, north and south on this island, are disturbing and they're frightening. Do you remember Aisling Murphy, the young teacher running along the canal at Tullamore in County Offaly when she was attacked and murdered? And attacks against women have taken place since then, many more. And like that fatal attack on Aisling in broad daylight. So what is wrong in our society? And what do we men need to look at in ourselves and in the culture? What is Patrick saying? And where his cry for justice? Patrick is a secular saint for all. He stands in that world of the secular sacred, which is not two worlds, a dualistic system, but one world. And social justice and the cry for social justice is in Patrick's passionate concern. And perhaps that is what makes him really stand out. Okay, we can have a general discussion. Were a couple of questions, they might go up in the chat. I need to find them. Yeah, the letter to the soldiers of Carotigus was an angry cry for justice. It's a plenary discussion, by the way. What do we need to be angry about today? And where is justice needed? Let's throw that one around for a while. The letter to Carotigus was an angry cry for justice. What do we need to be angry about today? And